Nike is the most recognized sports brand on earth, and right now, it is losing. Not to Adidas, not to a familiar rival. It is losing ground to brands most people had never heard of 5 years ago. The Swoosh built its empire by doing one specific thing: betting on athletes before they were famous, funding the unknowns, backing the locals, showing up in the sport before the sport showed up in the returns. That bet turned a company started with $500 each into a $260 billion business. Then Nike decided the model was too expensive. It cut the athletes, it cut the retailers, it moved the money into algorithms and apps, into data and conversion rates. And the brands that kept doing the original thing, quietly, without fanfare, stepped into the shelf space Nike had abandoned. By the time anyone inside Nike said stop, the company had lost more than $170 billion in market value. And the board, out of ideas, called a retired executive and asked him to undo 4 years of decisions that had each seemed, at the time, completely reasonable. This is a story about what happens when you optimize the humanity out of something built on humanity. It was in plain sight the whole time. To understand what Nike became, you first have to see what it started as. January 1964. Phil Knight is 26 years old. His former college track coach Bill Bowerman is 52. They seal a partnership with a handshake and $500 each and incorporate a company called Blue Ribbon Sports. There are no offices. There are no employees. There is Knight driving to track meets across the Pacific Northwest, opening the trunk of his car and selling imported Japanese running shoes to anyone who would listen. The product was Onitsuka Tiger, shoes Knight had scouted on a trip to Japan in November 1962 and secured U.S. West Coast distribution rights for on the spot. He sent samples to Bowerman. Bowerman didn't just order them, he pulled them apart. He started modifying them. He proposed a partnership in exchange for a stake because he already had ideas about how to make them faster. Bowerman was obsessed in the way that produces either greatness or madness. He shaved grams from soles. He studied biomechanics when the field barely had a name. One of Nike's most famous early innovations, the Waffle sole, came from Bowerman pressing rubber into his wife's waffle iron to test a new tread pattern. Form follows function. Function follows an old man in a kitchen at 4 in the morning. In 1971, they renamed the company Nike after the Greek goddess of victory. A design student named Carolyn Davidson created the Swoosh logo. The early identity was clear. This company existed for athletes, not for fashion, not for cultural status, for performance. And then, Nike did the thing that defined the next 50 years. In 1984, they signed a rookie named Michael Jordan. He was 21, fast, not yet famous, selected 3rd in the NBA draft, a talent without a trophy. Nike built him a shoe. Air Jordan launched in 1985. The bet paid immediately, and it paid for decades after. The lesson embedded into Nike's DNA was simple: find the human before the world does. Back them early. The return follows. For decades, that worked. For decades, the model held. Nike signed Tiger Woods in golf, Derek Jeter in baseball, hundreds of athletes across dozens of sports and categories. It partnered with USA Track and Field in 1991, and in 2014 extended that relationship with a 23-year agreement, one of the most substantial sponsorship contracts in Olympic sports. The brand was not just on the biggest stages, it was in the community, at the track, at the starting line of the local marathon. And the business that grew around all of this was enormous. Nike products moved through thousands of retail accounts across 40 countries. Foot Locker, Dick's Sporting Goods, JD Sports, regional chains, specialty stores in college towns and suburban strip malls. Each of those partners took a margin. Each one had its own staff, its own buyers, its own judgments about shelf placement. Nike was the biggest brand in every room it entered, but it didn't control the rooms. By the mid-2010s, the shift was visible to anyone running the numbers. Consumers were buying more online. Nike's own digital channel was growing. The math was simple and seductive. If Nike sold directly to the customer, it kept the full margin. No retailer taking 15 or 20% off the top. Full price, full data, full relationship. In 2017, Nike announced the Consumer Direct Offense. It would narrow its retail partner list. It would invest in its own stores and platforms. The word used was efficiency. The story told was modernity. Nike was evolving with the consumer. What the strategy did not account for, what no spreadsheet captured, was what those retailers actually did. The specialty running store was not a distribution point. It was where someone who cared about running spent an hour talking to someone who also cared about running. It was recommendation. It was community. It was the local race sponsors table, covered in Nike brochures, set up next to the finish line. Nike classified all of that as overhead. And overhead, eventually, you cut. The consumer direct offense became consumer direct acceleration. January 2020, John Donahoe is appointed CEO. He came from ServiceNow, from eBay, from Bain, a technology executive with expertise in digital transformation and virtually no background in footwear, in sport, or in brand management built on human emotion. The board chose him deliberately. The mandate was to scale digital. Within months of Donahoe taking over, the organizational structure changed. Sport-specific teams that had spent careers developing expertise in running, basketball, training, and football were restructured into generic divisions: men, women, kids. The specialists who understood what a marathon runner needed from a shoe, who could have a credible conversation with an elite athlete about performance, they were let go. Hundreds of them in the first 6 months. The marketing model shifted too. Nike's legacy campaigns had been built on emotion. The Michael Jordan failure ad, "Find Your Greatness During the London Olympics." The Colin Kaepernick campaign in 2018. Under the new model, the priority became performance marketing, data-driven, optimized for clicks. The goal was not cultural resonance. The goal was to lower the cost per acquisition and raise the conversion rate. By September 2021, Nike's CFO, Matthew Friend, told investors that Nike had exited approximately 50% of its retail partners. 50%. Chains dropped. Specialty stores abandoned. Shelf space vacated. In February 2022, Foot Locker, Nike's largest U.S. wholesale account, warned its own investors that Nike inventory would decline meaningfully. In December 2023, Nike announced a cost reduction plan targeting $2 billion over several years. In February 2024, more than 1,500 employees were notified of layoffs, about 2% of the global workforce. Each of these decisions had a logic: cut costs, improve margins, own the customer, focus on digital. Every choice was defensible in the quarter it was made. That is the thing about obvious blind spots. They are only obvious later, in plain sight, and nobody reads the fine print until the damage is already done. The question that should have been asked, the one that wasn't, at least not loudly enough, was simple. What was actually creating demand for Nike in the first place? And was that the same as the digital channel? For a while, the numbers looked right. Nike Direct grew to represent nearly 44% of total Nike brand sales by fiscal 2023. Revenue for fiscal 2024 reached $51.4 billion. Net income that year was $5.7 billion, up 12% year over year. Margins were improving. The stock had traded near $170 per share. The strategy appeared to be vindicated, but look at what was happening in the physical spaces Nike had chosen to exit. HOKA, a running brand owned by Deckers, the same company behind UGG boots, posted 59% revenue growth in fiscal 2023, reaching $1.4 billion in annual sales. On Running, the Swiss brand co-founded by a former world champion triathlete, grew 62% in 2022. New Balance posted 22% growth the same year. In the performance running category, the one where Nike's identity was born, the one Bowerman had obsessed over, Brooks became the #1 brand in U.S. running specialty retail. Nike's running revenue in that category fell over the same period, not a collapse, a quiet erosion, the kind that only looks urgent in retrospect. And here is the mechanism that was in plain sight. When Nike pulled out of a specialty running store, the store didn't close. It reordered. It put HOKA on the shelf. It put On Running on the shelf. It put New Balance on the shelf. The recommendation, the conversation between the runner and the salesperson who watched them walk, still happened. It just happened with a different shoe. In March 2024, Donahoe acknowledged on a quarterly earnings call that the strategy needed important adjustments. Revenue was flat. He outlined a reset: more sport, more product innovation, more wholesale. Wedbush analyst Tom Nikic issued a note that same week. Nike had focused on where it sold and not what it sold. The hindsight was arriving, slowly, then all at once. Elliott Hill joined Nike in 1988 as an intern. He stayed for 32 years. He worked his way through sales, through retail operations, through region after region, eventually rising to lead Nike's consumer and marketplace business. The division that managed relationships with wholesale partners, with retailers, with the distribution network that put Nike shoes on shelves across the world. He understood that infrastructure at a granular level, which accounts trusted Nike, which stores built communities around the brand, what it meant to have a Nike representative walk into a running store on a Tuesday afternoon and understand what the runners in that town actually needed. In October 2020, 9 months into John Donahoe's tenure, Hill retired. He was 59. He left quietly, no public dispute, no exit interview. He had spent 32 years at the company. He stepped away. For 4 years, he watched from the outside. He watched Nike's market capitalization fall from $263 billion at the end of 2021 to $113 billion at the end of 2024, a decline of more than 57% in 3 years. He watched the brands that had been on the periphery when he worked there grow into genuine rivals. He watched Nike's roster in professional tennis quietly contract, a sport where Nike had once dressed nearly every top-ranked player, now reduced to a small handful who had renewed. He watched New Balance and HOKA and On Running take shelf space that Nike had decided it no longer needed to hold. What he witnessed from the outside was not a sudden collapse, but a slow unwinding. One partnership announcement, one athlete deal let expire, one retail account exited for the sake of efficiency. None of it catastrophic in the quarter it happened, all of it meaningful in aggregate. He said nothing publicly. He didn't write about what he would have done differently. He watched. In September 2024, Nike's board made a decision. They were not looking for a technology executive. They were not looking for someone with a fresh vision about platform strategy. They called the man who had spent 32 years building the machine they were trying to repair. On September 19th, Nike announced that Elliott Hill would return as president and chief executive officer. Effective October 14th, 2024. John Donahoe stepped down. Hill walked into a company that was quieter, smaller, and more uncertain than the one he had left. He called a meeting with the leadership team. He did not present a slide deck about digital transformation. He said, "Sport is our North Star." 6 words. The quietest reversal in retail history. Meta Intro described what followed as one of the most aggressive strategic pivots in retail history. Dismantling the direct-to-consumer model that had defined the last 5 years, and rebuilding the wholesale relationships that had once made Nike dominant. But in Hill's framing, it was not a pivot. It was a return. The company had left something behind. He was going back to find it. The numbers, once they arrived, were not gentle. Fiscal 2025, the year ending May 31st, 2025, was the accounting of the damage. Nike's revenue fell 10%, from $51.4 billion to $46.3 billion. Net income dropped 44% to $3.2 billion. Diluted earnings per share fell 42%. Nike's market capitalization, which had touched $263 billion at the end of 2021, fell to approximately $89 billion by June 2025. In 3.5 years, the company had shed more than $170 billion in market value. Here is the acidic beat. Nike spent $4.29 billion on advertising and promotion in fiscal 2024 alone, more than it had ever spent. More than the combined annual revenue of HOKA and On Running put together, and still it lost the running aisle. New Balance reached $9.2 billion in 2025 annual sales, up 19% in a single year, up 180% since 2020. The brand your father wore as a punchline is now one of the fastest growing athletic companies on earth. And it grew by doing exactly what Nike had decided was too expensive to keep doing: investing in athletes, maintaining wholesale relationships, showing up in the specialty running market where the real runners shop. HOKA and On Running each crossed $2 billion in annual revenue. Brooks led U.S. performance running specialty. These were not technology companies. They had no platform strategy. They had relationships, and they kept them. The athlete cuts had a texture too. Players in the ATP, who had built their career identity around the swoosh, found that Nike was not returning calls on renewals or was offering only product, shoes and kits, with no financial support. They signed with New Balance, with On, with Adidas. The runners who used to discover Nike in a specialty store, talking to someone who watched them walk before recommending a shoe, discovered HOKA instead. The recommendation still happened. Nike just wasn't there for it. Elliott Hill was cutting costs too. 775 U.S. distribution jobs in 2025, 1,400 technology roles. But the direction had reversed. Wholesale partners were being called. Nike returned to Amazon as a direct vendor after 6 years away. Sport was the organizing principle again. The machine was being reassembled. The question no one could answer was, how much of what had been dismantled could actually be rebuilt? Elliott Hill says sport is Nike's North Star. The company is coming back to wholesale. Athlete relationships are being rebuilt. But the runners who went to On Running haven't come back yet. The specialty stores that reordered their shelves for New Balance haven't reversed those decisions. The athletes who signed elsewhere are under contract. It is tempting to frame this as one CEO's mistake, one strategy, correctable. But that reading is too simple. John Donahoe didn't invent the logic that drove the pivot, he accelerated it. The logic came from the numbers, from the margins, from the forecasts, from the reasonable observation that every dollar flowing through a retailer was a dollar Nike wasn't keeping. The board understood that logic. The analysts praised it. Every quarter, the same spreadsheet made the same argument. Nobody said, stop. What was invisible, what is always invisible until it isn't, was the human infrastructure underneath, the athlete before they were famous, the store where the running community formed, the person who watched a runner walk across a floor before recommending a shoe. None of that appeared on the balance sheet, until it disappeared. Then it appeared in everything that followed. There is a pattern here that extends beyond Nike. Brands built on human connection eventually find a way to measure that connection, and then they find a way to cut the measurement. The efficiency is real, the short-term return is real, and so is the space left open for the brand that kept showing up in person. Nike will recover. It has recovered before, from harder positions, with less cash. The question is what it recovers into. The brands that replaced it in the running aisle didn't win on technology. They won on presence. They were there, in the store, at the race, with the athlete before it mattered. That is the thing Nike built its empire doing. The swoosh knows how it works. The question is whether it can remember fast enough.